Warning: this content may be very disturbing to some people. Marc Dutroux is a name that still haunts Belgium, a man whose crimes were so horrifying, so grotesque, that they left an entire nation scarred forever. He wasn't just a predator. He was a mastermind of manipulation, a sadist who turned his home into a living hell for the innocent young victims he kidnapped, tortured, and abused. But the most disturbing part: Dutroux claimed he was working for powerful figures, financiers, elites, and politicians who used him to supply their own twisted desires. Marc Dutroux was born in 1956 in Belgium. From an early age, he exhibited disturbing behavior. By his teenage years, he was known for being manipulative and aggressive, someone who craved control. As an adult, he turned to crime, starting with petty thefts and gradually escalating to far more sinister activities. In the 1980s, Dutroux was convicted of kidnapping and sexually assaulting 5 young girls. At the time, authorities recognized how dangerous he was, and he was sentenced to 13 years in prison. But despite the severity of his crimes, Dutroux was released early after serving just 3 years. This shocking decision would have catastrophic consequences, as it allowed Dutroux to return to society and continue his reign of terror. When Dutroux was released, he began meticulously planning his crimes. He didn't just abduct his victims, he constructed a dungeon beneath his house in Marcinelle. This was no ordinary basement. It was a cold, damp, soundproof cell, hidden behind a heavy steel door. The space was barely large enough for a person to move, and the walls were thick enough to muffle even the loudest screams. This dungeon became the site of unimaginable suffering for his victims. In 1995, Dutroux began targeting his first known victims. Julie Lejeune and Melissa Russo were just 8 years old when he spotted them walking home from school. Dutroux lured them into his van, promising them safety, and drove them to his home. The moment they entered the dungeon, their nightmare began. Julie and Melissa were thrown into the cold, dark cell. They screamed for help, but no one could hear them. Dutroux didn't just imprison them. He abused them in every possible way. He used their fear and innocence to control them, feeding them only scraps of food to keep them alive for his twisted pleasure. The abuse was constant, and Dutroux filmed much of what he did, creating a grotesque archive of their suffering. For months, Julie and Melissa clung to each other, whispering in the dark, trying to keep hope alive. But their situation grew more desperate with each passing day. Then, in a cruel twist of fate, Dutroux was arrested for an unrelated car theft and sent to jail. He left the girls in the care of his wife, Michelle Martin, who knew exactly what was happening in the dungeon. But Michelle did nothing to help them. She didn't feed them, didn't check on them. She simply let them starve to death. Julie and Melissa died alone in the dark, their tiny bodies huddled together on the cold concrete floor. When their remains were discovered, investigators found scratches on the walls of the dungeon, faint marks of their desperate attempts to escape. Not long after Julie and Melissa were taken, Dutroux set his sights on 2 older girls, Anne Marchal and Yves Lambrex. Anne, 17, and Yves, 19, were vibrant teenagers enjoying a night out at a seaside festival. But as they left the event, they crossed paths with Dutroux and his accomplice, Michel Lelièvre. The 2 men offered the girls a ride home, pretending to be friendly strangers. Anne and Yves hesitated, but eventually they got into the van. Once inside, they were overpowered and drugged. When they woke up, they were in the dungeon. Anne and Yves endured weeks of unimaginable abuse. Dutroux treated them like objects, subjecting them to physical and psychological torture. He chained them to the walls, leaving them no chance to escape. The dungeon became their world, a place of endless suffering where every day brought new horrors. Eventually, Dutroux decided they were too much of a risk. He murdered both girls, burying their bodies in shallow graves in his backyard. For months, their families searched desperately for them, plastering their photos on every street corner. But the truth was hidden beneath the dirt in Dutroux's garden, a grim secret he carried with him as he continued his crimes. In 1996, Dutroux abducted 2 more girls, Sabine Dardenne, 12, and Laetitia Delez, 14. Sabine was riding her bike home from school when Dutroux pulled up beside her in his van. Before she could react, he grabbed her, dragged her into the vehicle, and sped off. Sabine woke up in the dungeon, her neck chained to the wall. Dutroux began his usual cycle of abuse, but this time, he added a psychological element to his torture. He told Sabine her parents didn't care about her, that no one was looking for her, and that he was the only one protecting her. These lies were meant to break her spirit, to make her dependent on him. Weeks later, Letitia was abducted in a similar way. The two girls were kept together in the dungeon, enduring the same horrors. They clung to each other for support, whispering words of comfort in the dark. Dutroux continued to torment them, using their fear and desperation to assert his control. Sabine would later describe how Dutroux would eat meals in front of them, mocking their hunger, treating them as less than human. But Sabine and Letitia's nightmare ended differently. In August 1996, a botched investigation into a separate crime led police to Dutroux's home. During a search of the house, they discovered the steel door to the dungeon. When they pried it open, they found Sabine and Letitia alive, but barely able to stand. The girls were pale, trembling, and malnourished, but they had survived. Their rescue marked the end of Dutroux's reign of terror, but it also brought to light the full extent of his atrocities. When police investigated further, they uncovered the remains of Julie, Melissa, Anne, and Ifji buried on Dutroux's properties. The discovery shocked Belgium and sparked outrage. But the horror didn't end there. During his trial, Dutroux claimed he wasn't acting alone. He alleged that he was part of a larger network, supplying young victims to powerful elites, including politicians and businessmen. He claimed these individuals financed his crimes and protected him from prosecution. Many of these allegations were dismissed as lies, but the evidence surrounding Dutroux's case left lingering questions. Some witnesses came forward, describing parties where children were abused by influential figures. Others spoke of evidence that had mysteriously disappeared or been destroyed. To this day, many believe Dutroux's crimes were just the tip of the iceberg, a glimpse into a darker, more widespread network. Marc Dutroux was sentenced to life in prison, but for many, that wasn't enough. The scars he left behind will never heal. The families of his victims live with the pain every day, and the survivors carry the weight of what they endured. Marc Dutroux isn't just remembered as a monster, he's remembered as a failure of society. A man who was allowed to prey on the innocent because the system failed to stop him. His story remains one of the darkest chapters in modern history, a chilling reminder of the evil that can hide in plain sight.